Today on the No City on the Sideline Dad podcast, episode number 87. Today, my guest is Michaela Foster Marsh, the author of the book Starchild Memoirs about her adopted brother Frankie, Michaela's journey to find out more about her brother next on the podcast. Let's do this.
Welcome to the No Sitting on the Sideline Dad podcast, a podcast about a journey of discovery and conversations about not sitting on the sideline of life. Let's get involved. Here's host Joe Foley.
Hey, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here. Hey, my name is Joe Foley, and I want to thank you for being here too. First time, welcome. Welcome to the podcast. I really appreciate you being here. This is the podcast about a journey of discovery. And also, I like these kind of stories to come up today. And my next guest, Michaela Foster Marsh. We're going to talk about our adopted brother and the journey of finding his original family. We don't adoption, original family, but birth parents, birth family from another country, Uganda. Michaela is the founder and executive director of Starchild Charities, which helps out with vulnerable children and women. Michaela's new book, Starchild, is about a book about the search of Frankie's family and love for her brother. And she really expressed a lot of that in the interview. I really enjoyed talking to Michaela about her journey looking for her brother's family in Uganda and what she found. You'd be surprised. And how it touched her. And also the charity, the Starchild Charity, what they do for the kids in Uganda. Because it gives them kind of a purpose. The kids, give them education, give them things, and they can do things for themselves. And that's important. And also how Starchild Charity started a school for creative arts in Uganda. It's amazing what you can do to bring out the best in people. Really great conversation. Let's jump right in. Welcome to the podcast, Michaela.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks for having me on.
I got to ask you a question. Growing up in the 60s when you're an adopted brother, what was one of the favorite memories you had with your brother?
There's so many of them. I can hardly. My goodness. I think he was always so protective of me when we were out together, and people always used to think that we were actually boyfriend and girlfriend. And we used to have a lot of fun with that. At school, people assumed that we were boyfriend and girlfriend because we spent so much time together, and they couldn't quite relate the black and the white. And then when people would find out that we were actually, brother and sister, I think that kind of spoiled it for them. We used to have a lot of fun just hamming it up, and sometimes we would just pretend we were. I think that's probably one of my favourite memories, is just us laughing about the fact that people just couldn't relate to the fact that we were brother and sister, so they just assumed we were dating each other at school.
Well, it must have been different too, growing up in an adopted family and also being a multiracial adoption too. What kind of challenges did you face with that?
Well, it was very unusual in those days. I mean, transracial adoption just was literally unheard of when we were growing up. And I think, for my mum, we would get pushed down the road in a twin pram, and it was a very unusual sight. And people were really curious about who Frankie was, where he came from, why he was in a twin pram alongside me, milk bottle white, freckles and red hair. Two more different children you couldn't find. And people wanted to kind of touch him and hold him, touch his hair. It was very unusual. So it's just the same way now I go to Uganda. The kids, they put their finger in their mouth and then they try and rub my freckles off because they can't believe I've got these freckles on my skin, and then they want to touch my hair because it's so soft compared to their hair, which is quite wiry. So in those days, people were really curious about Frankie. And then when we got into primary school, we just went into the classroom telling people we were twins, which again, people just found this really unusual, but they accepted it. Children accept that kind of thing much easier, and they don't grow up with any racism, when they're young. They're not born with it. And so they just accepted Frankie and I as being twins, and our teachers finally just, realised, they are like twins, so which is quite natural. Then, like I say, when we got into high school, there was more trouble then, I think. By and large, we were really lucky in Glasgow. There wasn't an awful lot of racial tension. I think that there was a bit more down in England, a bit more down south. But certainly there was a number of occasions where Frankie was arrested for crimes that he didn't commit just because of the colour of his skin. There was another boy locally who was never out of prison, a black guy who was never out of prison. And when he was arrested, they would just all say, well, they all look the same to us. It's terrible. And of course they don't. And I mean, now the work that I do in Uganda with Starchild Charity, I mean, I can now identify different tribes, the cheekbones, the facial structure, the nose, the color of the skin is so different sometimes, or the height. Some tribes are really tall, others are smaller. So, but the police in those days would just say, well, they all look alike to us. And Dad would have to go down to the police station and get Frankie out of there. And I do sometimes think, I wonder if Dad, A, wasn't wearing a dog collar because he was a minister, and B, didn't have white skin, if it would have been so easy to get Frankie out of there. So there was some definite tensions. And then the pubs and clubs we went to, as I say, basically we were blessed in Glasgow that it's pretty much a melting pot and very cosmopolitan, but you're always going to get people who don't like the colour of somebody's skin. So I think that we both had a kind of peripheral vision and just knew if we could sense something, we would leave. Because Frankie, he wasn't a fighter. He could fight. My dad showed him a few bobs and weaves because my dad had been in the boxing ring in his youth. And I think they came in handy occasionally for Frankie. But I mean, he basically didn't want any trouble and could pretty much steer himself out of trouble with his sense of humour, which was really an asset to him and to us all, really. He did have a brilliant sense of humour.
Brilliant sense of humour. Can you give me an example?
Oh, gosh, no. I can't think right now. I can't think. Well, I think just the fact that he would always, even joke with people that I was his girlfriend, if there was any problems. So I think that was yeah. He just could laugh at himself. I can't think offhand of any incidents. If I do, I'll let you know later.
Well, it's one thing that's interesting too. I know you're very, very fond of your brother and stuff like that. And in the book, you talk about him in the book. Also, too, what was it like growing up in your family? How was the family with all this?
I think we were a pretty close family. I think that, the adoption agency were really concerned about Frankie and I being the same age. And so they took their time with the adoption going through because there was only weeks between us. And they were worried about territorial issues. And there really weren't any territorial issues. Frankie and I bonded really well. I think that sometimes maybe the adoption agency overlooked the fact that there was an older boy, Stephen, so he was 8 years older. And I think maybe it had more of an effect on Stephen because I got a new play pal, whereas Stephen was a bit older. So, I don't have the best relationship with my brother. Mm-hmm. I love him dearly, but we don't have the closest relationship. And I think that Frankie and I became closer, and maybe that had more of an effect on Stephen. My parents, they adored Frankie. There were some challenges, I think, with my mum. And I think sometimes with some adopted children, and I can only really speak about my own self and, my own lens really with transracial adoption. But I think there was maybe some testing behaviour with Frankie, with my mum. I think, he was insecure about the love. I think because he'd been, given up by his mum, I think the psychological scar there, that wound was still there. And so there was some testing behaviour with mum, which she found difficult. Almost like she had to keep proving whether, she loved him. So he would push the boundaries a lot with mum, much more so than with Dad. And Dad he had been adopted himself. He was very keen I think he would have adopted lots and lots of children. But I do think that my mum had some struggles with Frankie, and it wasn't out of not loving him. The love was definitely there, I think. But there was an internal struggle, yeah, with testing behaviour and pushing the boundaries with my mum all the time.
Something happened to your brother, and I don't know if you want to talk about that, and how did it make you feel?
Oh, yes. Yeah, Frankie died when he was 27 in a house fire. And it was just an accident. It had been the coldest night of the year, and there'd been a power failure that night in Glasgow. And when Frankie went home, he lay down on the couch. He'd obviously put the lights on and off, and the same with the heater, the on-off switch. And sometimes you don't know whether the lights are on or off. And the same thing with the heater. And during the night, the heater came on. And unfortunately, it started a fire in the flat, and Frankie died. I was absolutely devastated. I thought my world had ended. I thought that I would be in a constant posture of mourning, basically. The grief, I was relatively young and hadn't experienced anything like that at all. And also, I was living in Canada at the time. So I didn't really people didn't know Frankie. They might have seen some pictures of him, but I didn't have my family around me. I obviously went back home after Frankie died, but for a short time, and then I had to return to Canada. So I did feel a sense of isolation in my grief at that point. But I mean, I have been able to work through it. I worked through a lot by writing. I wrote songs at that time and recorded albums. And I think I used my grief, the energy from that. I propelled it into my songwriting. And then latterly, I started to write more books and a fictional novel very loosely based on Frankie's mother, who gave him up for adoption. And then I wrote the real story. So for me, the writing has always been, I think, quite therapeutic. And prayer and meditation, I try and ground myself every day with prayer and meditation.
Well, I mean, after that, you wrote the book and your journey to Uganda. What was that like? What is the experience for you with meeting Frankie's family?
It was remarkable. I mean, that whole story unfolds in the book, and it's just a tremendous story. And I think it proves that there's a continuous thread that connects us even after death, because the coincidences that happened to me on that journey, the synchronicities, they're just absolutely remarkable, quite stunning. I mean, for me to find his family in a country of like 43 million people at the time,
Mm-hmm.
it was like finding a needle in a haystack. I mean, what were the chances of me finding Frankie? I mean, after my mum died, I found a sort of folder that had Frankie's adoption on the heading, and that had always been really curious as a child who Frankie's mother was. And Frankie, when we asked Frankie, my dad sat down with us when we were about 10 years old, and this is all in the book as well. And he had said to Frankie, "Do you want to know anything about your African family? We've got some information here. It's not a lot to go on, but we have it." And Frankie was very defensive. He didn't want to know. I don't want to know anything about them. They didn't want to know me. I'm Scottish. You're my family. And I really think that Frankie was scared. I think he might have thought we would send him back to Africa, to a country and a family he couldn't identify with. So I had been curious, but it wasn't my place to ask those questions. And I knew that he was oddly incurious. And I think it was a defense mechanism. So I knew better than to go there with Frankie. It wasn't until he was older, and just actually not long before he died, that he started to express an interest in finding out about his family. And my dad was putting the stuff together for him. And then, of course, he died. So after my mum died and I inherited all the paperwork, when I saw that folder with Frankie's adoption heading on it, I was nervous opening the folder, but it was like I wanted to know who this woman was that had given up my brother for adoption and the circumstances surrounding it and why she had done that. And I'd always hoped in my heart that she had never really wanted to give him up, that it was circumstances. And from what I could read, that was the case. And it just sent me off my imagination. I just wondered about this woman, Janet Wivugera, and I discovered that Frankie had actually been conceived in Belfast. I'd always thought it was Scotland, but she was actually a student in Belfast. So in 1962, when Uganda got independence, it sent its really bright students over here to the UK to study, and they paid for their education. So she had basically come out here to study in Belfast and then fallen pregnant and came over here to Scotland to have the child in secrecy, and then went back over to Ireland to complete her studies. So I then had some tangible links and set out on this journey to try and trace as much as I could about the family and about Frankie's beginnings. And that story, like I say, it unfolds in the book, and it is absolutely remarkable. The journey it took me on, I ended up, like I say, Belfast, Lincoln, Farnham, London, and then over to Uganda, where I discovered that I'd written about a fictional character loosely based on his mum, who taught at a school called Gayaza High School for Girls. Now, I just invented this out of my imagination, and I discovered that Janet had actually studied as a young girl at the Gaza High School for young girls.
Oh, wow.
I mean, you could not make that up. It was just incredible. And that Frankie's grandfather had been the pastor of that school from 1950 to 1960. So I also discovered that he had become a saint. He'd been made canon with Uganda. Just remarkable. And of course, my own father was a minister of the Church of Scotland. So much of that book mirrors the reality. It's just incredible. And so all of the story unfolds in the Starchild book.
Well, that's interesting. What else other things you experienced when you were there?
Well, I found his whole family. I found his brothers. The saddest thing was that Janet had died. But I'd managed to see a picture of Janet the day that I went to Gaza High School. And she was so like Frankie. It was just incredibly, incredibly emotional for me. I just completely broke down. I think just all this stuff from childhood, everything I'd ever imagined about this woman, there she was in the picture. And then I was being told that he had brothers that were still alive, that Janet had 4 other children. One had died, and that child's name was Stephen, and my brother's name's Stephen. I mean, again, the connections are just outstanding. And then within about 2 hours of being at Gaza High School, I was introduced to his blood brother, who's called Frank. He has the same name.
Oh, wow.
And he looks like him.
Oh, that must have been kind of an interesting experience.
I could hardly string a sentence together. I mean, I was just bubbling like a baby when I saw him because he just looked so like Frankie. And of course, he didn't really know why this strange white woman was crying all over him. And, then I had to try and explain the story to them with as much sensitivity as I could, because I really didn't expect to find that I had all these brothers in Uganda. I'd hoped that maybe I could have found Janet. Maybe I could have eased her mind that Frankie had been looked after and cared for. I mean, if you think about it from Janet's perspective, she was giving up a child in a white country, and you don't know what could have happened to Frankie. I sometimes think, my goodness, if my parents hadn't have come along and adopted Frankie, there's so many, I don't know about over there, but here in the UK at the moment, there's been so many horror stories been unlocked about children in care in those days. It's quite shocking, and it's really been bringing it home to me just how brave and what a wonderful thing my parents had done at that time, especially if you look back to the time that they adopted Frankie in 1967, when Frankie came first as a foster, and then in 68. In 1968, Martin Luther King had just been killed.
Yep.
And we had the civil rights movement, and it was infiltrating over here. There's no doubt about it on all the media. And yet my parents said, no, we don't care about the colour of the child's skin. We're adopting Frankie. And it was very brave of them. But if you also think about his mum leaving him, I think she obviously did it because she thought she was doing it for the best. But his life could have turned out so differently. And I just feel, thank God, for the blessings that we were able to have Frankie in our lives, because he added so much to our lives. And now I'm able to carry on his legacy through the charity and the work that we do in Uganda in Frankie's memory, because I've met a family that I have a connection with, and brothers. There's another brother, David, and there's another brother, Paul, in America.
Wow, There's a lot of connections and interesting stories. One thing I was curious about too is the Starchild Charity. What is that?
When I was in Uganda and I met the family, not only was I completely overwhelmed by the fact that overnight I'd inherited 3 new Ugandan brothers and was trying to come to terms with a whole culture that I knew nothing about. But I was also overwhelmed by the amount of poverty that I saw firsthand, and also the amount of orphans and children, vulnerable children, and any one of them could have been Frankie. So I came home back to Scotland, changed on many levels. And I think when I started to talk about this to my friends and family, they really got on board and said, we need to set up this charity with you. And so I knew nothing about setting up a charity, but the universe kept providing and people kept coming along. And before I knew it, we had got charitable status. I had a friend, Lynn Campbell. I put out a message one day on Facebook to say, I'm tearing my hair out. I have no idea all the paperwork for this charity, for charitable status. I didn't know what I was doing. And Lynn Campbell responded instantly and said, Michaela, I do this for a living. Can I help you? And Lynn had gone to school with Frankie and I, so she had a genuine connection with us both. So Lynn and I, sat through all the applications, and we managed to pull it off in months and got the clearance to start the charity. And then within 2 years, we had built a school for creative arts in Uganda. And again, all of that is in the book, how we managed to do that on a shoestring, basically, and through social media and friends. So we now have a school in memory of Frankie for creative arts, because in Uganda, if you're not academic, you're very much left aside. The kids there all want to be doctors and lawyers and pilots, and not all children are academic. And I certainly wasn't academic at school, and my heart went out to some of the children I met who were not faring as well at school. And there was one day I saw this boy who really looked very sad and kind of at the back of the classroom, and I asked about him, and the teacher said, well, he's just stupid. And I remember getting told that I was stupid by a teacher at school, and how painful. And I held on to that for a long, long time. It's probably one of the reasons it took me so long to actually write a book was her haunting words of being stupid. And I said to the teacher, how do you know that child is stupid? How do you know if you don't know if you put a paintbrush in the child's hand that he couldn't become the greatest painter in Uganda or become Picasso? And she said, well, we don't have money for pencils, let alone paintbrushes, and I'm not going to get the child's hope up. And I think it was that day I left that school, I was quite upset by it, not just the poverty and the orphans, but the fact that teachers could call children stupid, and that there was absolutely no outlet whatsoever for children who maybe were not so academically inclined, and that the country as a whole doesn't seem to embrace the arts as something as positive as we do here. It's changing slowly, but by and large, it's not really part of the curriculum at school. So we set about trying to build a school for creative arts to offer these children an opportunity, and also to teach some vocational skills that can perhaps lead to jobs.
Well, interesting question. Any stories you could share, like any kids that gone through the stuff you talked about?
Yeah, I mean, we have got children that are now making all of their own garments. I mean, at primary level, we've got children that couldn't sew at all, and that we know that were not particularly clever at school, that have gone into the arts program at the Starchild school, and they are now making outfits. I mean, I thought I was pretty good at that age. I could make myself little tops and things. but these children, and they're giving it, the last time we were there, we got a little fashion show, and they're making handbags and things. So if those children are maybe not going to be, scientists, but they actually have a chance of making a living now because of our program, because they know how to sew. Even if they're doing repairs for garments, they've got an opportunity now in life because of our program. And we've got another couple of children who have won some art competitions. And I mean, just for them to win something. I mean, I remember getting a prize at school. It was a prize for the most effort. I mean, I was never going to get a prize for anything academic, but I got a prize for the most effort. And just to be able to have children get a prize for a piece of art, you don't know how that's going to affect their self-confidence.
Definitely, and that definitely helps their self-confidence too.
Yeah, so it's really, really important. And also, some people knock the arts, but the arts, that's the ambassador of your country. People aren't going to remember who built the road. No offense to engineers. Mm-hmm. People remember who made that beautiful painting, who wrote that lovely song, who wrote that book, who designed that garment. These are the ambassadors for the country. So if we can start to introduce this at a young age to the children, and I mean, arts helps with language and social skills, communication, decision making. They're having to take risks, when they're doing anything in the arts. So it's encompassing all the developmental skills. So to me, a school for creative arts is just as valuable as a regular school.
Wow. It's just amazing. And listen to the stuff you're talking about. And I'm actually, well, we're in the conversation. I'm looking at the webpage now, and a lot of it's very interesting. I suggest people to check it out.
StarchildCharity.org, that's our website if anybody is interested in checking it out. And my own is michaelaonline.com.
Well, that's where they can connect. And thank you very much for being on the podcast there. I really do appreciate it, Michaela.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much.
Wrapping up this episode, I want to thank Michaela Foster Marsh for being a guest on the podcast. You can find more about her over at StarchildCharities.com. All the links, everything you want to know about Star Charity in her book is over at StarCharities.com. You can find all the links in the show notes over at NoSittingOnTheSideline.com/87. Hey, please reach out and leave a comment, have a question, or if you just want to start a conversation. Another place you can start another conversation would be the No Sitting on the Sideline Dad Podcast Facebook group. Leave a message or comment, or just say hello and tell me how this interview. You can find all my contact information at NoSittingOnTheSideline.com/contact. So I want to thank you for being here. You know, it's nothing but love of family, brothers and sisters. It doesn't matter if you're multiracial or adopted. It's all about family. It's important. That's connections we have to this world. And it's also kind of cool when you find out that when somebody passes away and you adopt a brother and you find out the other part of their family, and then you gain another whole bunch of people into your family. Kind of cool. It was a great episode, and I really enjoyed Michaela Foster's interview. Well, thank you for listening. Until next time, appreciate your time together. Appreciate family, appreciate people, appreciate relationships, because that's the most important thing in the world. Until next time, take care. God bless. See ya.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. Please subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates of the show and helpful and useful tips. This has been a production of Foley 42 Media.